Hello, everyone. My name is Pil-Young Kim. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Denver. And I study and teach the impact of AI, artificial intelligence, on child development. Today, I want to share some scientific findings and my reflection based on my research into those scientific findings with you on a topic that some of you might be interested in knowing more and understanding more. So that is, does AI make us to be more creative or more average? So it's actually a really great question that I myself, as teaching undergraduate students, have been wondering a lot. And because ever since ChatGPT has been available, and now there are more tools that are available, and I can see the impact of generative AI on students' work. Indeed, the survey that was done actually this year in the UK, 92% of the undergraduate students reported to use ChatGPT in different ways, right? Like it can be generating some ideas and brainstorming, but it is pretty widely used approach among undergraduate students. In the US, the rate is lower, and I find also to be very interesting. Like I can see the use of ChatGPT is pretty common, but it's very interesting that US students also report quite a bit of anxiety about using ChatGPT. So, because I think they've heard a story of like student being expelled from school using ChatGPT for their assignment. And I think there's a quite a bit this like mixed feeling that they will find ChatGPT to be or generative AI can be very helpful, but at the same time have quite a bit of fear about using it for their assignments. And if you're not familiar with US educations, in the US, a lot of students in college, they pay really expensive tuition to study. So as a person who's teaching undergraduate students, when I see students work that, there's some clear evidence that the majority of the work was actually generated by ChatGPT, like such as like their final project, it's writing, it makes me feel a little sad that about the lost opportunity that they had about learning, for paying such a high tuition that they came to learn. And it made me concerned and sad that, the student has lost that opportunity in this case, which I understand why a student might have had to do that because of a lot of demands that students might have and high workload. But again, so as an educator and also psychologist, I wondered a lot about this question that does AI help or hinder students' creativity and work quality, right? So let's kind of dive into the study that I found to be actually very insightful. So this study was actually published last year. And in this study, this was done in UK. They have recruited 150 around that number of adults. And they've given these adults some few kind of topics and asked them to write like a short creative story. And people were divided into three different groups. In one group, people wrote their own creative stories without any help, without any interaction with ChatGPT. The second group, they were writing their short stories, but they were able to receive helpful suggestions from ChatGPT about their story once during the whole process. And the last condition, people were able to receive helpful suggestions from ChatGPT on their story multiple times, up to 5 times throughout the course of their writing. And once the story was written, and then the stories were provided to independent evaluators. And those evaluators evaluated a story on multiple dimensions, most importantly, the creativity, And creativity being, whether the story is novel and original, but also like useful and like kind of meeting the core kind of purposes of that task, right? And also the stories were evaluated whether, the story is interesting, funny, and also overall qualities as well. So the findings suggesting that it turned out that the stories that were written with the AI's help, so either once or multiple times, were rated to be more creative and over a higher quality compared to the stories that were written without ChatGPT's help. And this was based on the ratings by the evaluators who didn't know whether the stories were written with or without the help of ChatGPT. But there's actually a very important thing to consider here that this positive help from ChatGPT was particularly true among stories of people who had more kind of average creativity or a bit like less creative. So, what I mean by that, before people wrote stories, people also took this creativity test. So generally, just very in general, whether these participants were very creative or kind of average, have average creativity or lower creativity. So this help from the ChatGPT was particularly true for those people who had more kind of average or lower creativity based on this test. So then what happened to people with really high creativity, very creative people, right? It turned out that the help from ChatGPT didn't really help that much for them to have a higher score in terms of their creativities scores by those evaluators. So the bottom line here is that it seems to be that help from ChatGPT is particularly helpful for those people maybe who does not have as much confidence in that task, in this case, creative writing, or maybe not very familiar with the topic, right? So when those kind of initial difficulties and struggles, I think ChatGPT's help can be very helpful. On the other hand, for the very creative people might psychologically feel like they've gotten some help from ChatGPT, but might not actually really significantly influence the overall of the creative work for them. And then another actually side of this study that was so interesting is then, it seemed that using ChatGPT was helpful to improve the quality of the writing, but when they actually compared the stories between people, they found a trade-off that the stories that were created with the ChatGPT's help, they tend to look more similar. In another word, the stories that was genuinely created by human, 100% without ChatGPT's help, were more unique. So as you know, ChatGPT or generative AI being so prevalently available, there's also possibilities that over time our work will just become more and more and similar and alike that the researchers may call like homogenizing effect, that our work just becoming more and more like averaged, concentrated into this like kind of average. All right. And then I'm going to end with one thought I have that I feel like it's very important to consider interpreting the findings of this study. So remember, in the study, the ChatGPT didn't create the whole story, right? It was actually a very kind of structured and controlled way that how ChatGPT was used to kind of support people's writing process. But when we actually really thinking about how us or students may use ChatGPT, especially if we don't have a lot of time, that we may just provide a couple lines of prompts, and then the ChatGPT will create the entire story for us or entire essay in the matter of like few seconds or few minutes, right? And so in that case, I think whether AI can help our creativity might not really apply here because we didn't provide much input at all, right? And then that risk of our stories become more averaged, homogenizing is much greater here. right? And there are fewer opportunities for us and students to be able to exercise, practice in terms of how to best express our unique perspective and our creativity and as well as independent thinking. So I want to end with the suggestion that for all of us to kind of think about, which is how to best support students or even ourselves, right? That as tempting as it is, try not to use ChatGPT to creating like entire work, but I use it more kind of controlled way. How, it was done in this study is that, we're driving that creative process, but when we're stuck or we just need a kind of new ideas, use ChatGPT as like more like interactive, creative assistants that ask it to provide some helpful tips and suggestions throughout that process. That it seems like I think it's like the kind of best win-win situation, perhaps that we preserve our creative processes and really kind of pushing us to have a unique ideas and those can be expressed while getting some support from ChatGPT or generative AI. It can be sometimes very helpful to help us throughout that process. So, yeah, thank you for tuning in. And I'll come back with some other kind of insights from the scientific findings on another topic. Thank you.